Hi friends, so it's Derry Walls chapter 3 and this is part 3. The chapter's called Decision. If you listen to part 2, you'll remember that Sheila was asked to stay when the other hostages were let go, and she was just wondering why she'd been asked to stay. So she'd asked the question, why do you want me to stay, Wesly? Thinking that her parents would think she was very stupid. Wesly looked at her and smiled. I want you to do something for me. I want you to write some notes. Myself and the killer here are going to put some thoughts on paper, and we need you to do the writing. Is that alright? Sheila nodded and went off to find pen and paper. The first pen she lifted did not write, but she found another. As she scribbled, she noticed for the first time that her hands were shaking. She returned to the two men who were sitting in silence a few tables apart and once more staring into each other's hard faces. Sheila sat at another table that was not in between them but slightly out of the line of fire. If the trigger was pulled. She thought back to her mother's description of the shooting that she'd witnessed in the Troubles. Her mother had no time for the British Army at all and had been involved in many a riot on the Bogside. But the image of that young lad of 18, his look of surprise as a bullet ploughed into his forehead, had stayed with her. Then the blood as he slumped to the pavement, it was fixed in her mind, and she'd come to detest all the violence. From that day all the deaths in the Troubles mattered to her, whoever the victim was. She kept telling her children, we never want to return to all that. So here Sheila was now caught up in a major incident and worried that she too would witness a killing. She sat there watching the two men, and they seemed like a pair of cats to her. Though they didn't move, it was as if they were circling round each other, looking for weaknesses. But of course the real weakness was Patrick's. He had no firearm, and that set him at a considerable disadvantage. In fact, on the face of it, he looked as good as dead. So Wesly, Patrick broke the silence. What do you want written down? Wesly waved the gun about and said he wanted a confession. A confession from O'Hara that he'd murdered his father. I'll give you a factual account of what happened that morning, if that's what you're after. Wesly snarled back. A little remorse might be good, but don't put it on when you don't have any. Republican hypocrisy is sickening at any time. Patrick began his account 2 nights before. He met up with 2 other Republican men who outranked him in a public house in Castle Finn just over the border. The location of the house was explained, and he was told who the 2 volunteers were that he was to take with him. One of them already knew the house. The policeman was Sergeant Crockett, and he had recently been somewhat brutal in his treatment of some arrested IRA sympathisers, just youths in the Castle Doug area. He'd threatened to spread a rumour that one of them was an informer. The young guys were let out uncharged but somewhat traumatised by the experience. It was a known fact that Crockett was always home by 8 o'clock in the morning when he was working nights. He lived in an open and exposed spot very close to the Irish border, and would probably be sleeping. The order was to kill him but not to harm his wife. Patrick stopped speaking and waited to see if Sheila was getting all down. The young waitress nodded and asked him to continue with his account. Patrick gave details of the operation, the walk over the border fields early that morning, the waiting behind the ditch, and yes, he even remembered the young man leaving the house and then the walk up the track to the house. I gave no orders for the woman to be hit, and the person responsible was reprimanded afterwards. We entered the house, and sure enough the target, your father, was lying in a bed, and I fired off a few rounds of automatic gunfire, and I was sure he was dead. Yes, Wesly, you're well informed, I did take your father's life. I was fighting a war, and he was the enemy, and if you don't mind me saying so, he was crazy to be in the Royal Ulster Constabulary and live way up there in the hills above Claddagh. He was the owner of the farm, his inheritance, and he wasn't going to be driven off his land by scum like you, O'Hara. War? You were a bunch of murdering hooligans, not an army, and none of you clever rhetoric nor any of that from McGuinness or Adams will ever justify 1 drop of the blood you spilled. You were rebels against the established rule of law. Aye, we were. Rebels against an established rule of law that gave Catholics a disadvantage when seeking employment, promotion, housing or anything else. Only a fool would refuse to rebel against that. You guys never get it, do you? We were the niggers of Ireland. We may not have had chains, but you orange flag wavers controlled almost everything. Orangemen maintained order up here while the IRA of the uprising in the south fought a bloody civil war none of you want to talk about. What you maintained was an unjust system, and when the people started to march for civil rights, your boys were determined that such rights would never be given. Religious apartheid, my father called it, and he was right. So, you took the law into your own hands and started killing people. Do you call shooting a man in his bed a better form of justice? War is war. Did Britain wake up the people in Germany before they dropped bombs on them? The Republican was not going to be branded a murderer because he'd never seen himself as one. I would have preferred meeting your father in a battle where we were both awake and ready, but in war a man carries out his orders. That is what I did, Wesly. You can't squirm out of your guilt that way. Your orders came from a group of gangsters using the political cause as a means to terrorise the law-abiding Protestant community. Your orders were like those of the mafia. Soldiers, undisciplined criminal gangs. You want to see discipline, then go and look at the British Army. Patrick O'Hara roared so loud that it nearly got him shot at once. When he stopped laughing, he said, "Let me tell you a story about the British Army and their discipline. The paratroopers were in Coal Island on patrol one night, and the locals challenged them to a fight. They're in Coal Island. Well, them and the lads had a punch-up. The locals stole their weapons for IRA use. Oh, aye, the British Army's full of discipline, all right." Sheila had heard enough. She stopped writing, put the pen down and spoke up. "Would the two of you ever listen to yourselves? Don't you ever stop to think what it's like to be born on the other side?" Both men looked at her and then back at each other. It was O'Hara who spoke first. "Sheila, you don't even remember the Troubles, do you? How would you know anything about it?" "I've heard stories from both sides. My ma, she was in Derry. She was born in Derry. And she grew up in the Cregan. Her two brothers were in the IRA and she had an uncle who was an INLA man. INLA being the Irish National Liberation Army, a smaller but nonetheless very active Republican group." Sheila continued, "My dad, he was brought up a prod." That's a Protestant. "I heard all the other stuff from him. He grew up in Limavady and his father was in the RUC, but his uncle was a UVF man." UVF is the Ulster Volunteer Force, one of the loyalist, pro-British paramilitary organisations. "When they got married, a lot of them were against us, or against it, and they went to live in England for a while. But we all live in Derry now. I was brought up a Catholic, but I know about both sides. Trouble is, neither side ever tries to understand the other. Would you two men like something to eat?" Outside, in the afternoon sun, the inspector and his men were surrounded by TV crews, pressmen and representatives of both communities, including two priests and a rather large Protestant minister. "Would you please ask Friar Tuck and all these people to stay behind the police lines?" The constable smiled at the description of the so-called Reverend McCann, and he moved the press, the clergy and all the others back. That left him a bit more peace to work out what to do. Crockett had refused any communication with the hostage negotiator, and he'd also refused to allow the returned cleric to come and talk with him. A rush on the building would probably lead to the detonation of the bomb, or at least the use of Crockett's firearms. It seemed that one man had the city police force at stalemate for now. To make matters worse, he had all the press here now, and not just Jerry O'Loughlin of the Derry Journal. The policeman was not a man who liked publicity, and nor was he an individual who liked decisions taken out of his hands, but there was already pressure from above, and some of that was because the high rankers in the police service for Northern Ireland were being pressured by local politicians, journalists and the government in full measure from Westminster. The Northern Ireland minister had stated that the matter was being successfully dealt with. A meaningless term made by someone from the comfort of an office. The reality, standing in the street, was a little different from that. How could the situation be successfully dealt with? Sheldon looked at his watch. So much for the concert he was supposed to be taking his wife and kids to in Coleraine in a few hours. Sometimes he just wondered why he did this job at all. So, still more of chapter 3 to come. Hope you're getting an idea of how people think if you're from outside Ireland. Two communities, very different upbringings, very different loyalties. That's put into people from birth. And you and I too have things put in us from birth. Maybe we were brought up in a different culture from the one and the belief system that we have now. Things were put into us and they have an effect on how people act. And I've certainly seen that here in Northern Ireland. And lovely people on both sides with prejudice put into them from a very early age. Hope you're enjoying the story, and it's very nice to share with you just the imaginations of my mind built around some of the things I've seen here in this beautiful but sometimes tragic country. Love to you both. Next episode to follow soon. That was love from us both, I should say. Bye for now. Bye bye.